why did we evolve to feel like we have free will? So first question is, do we feel like we have free will? And that sounds like an uncontroversial question, but it isn't. I mean, there's some people like Sam Harris who has argued recently that people don't actually feel free will. That if you actually spend the time to introspect, there's no specific feeling of it really. I mean, I think people do distinguish between. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanism. So one of the things that seems to be important for the experience of free will is predictability. If something is predicted by the brain, that is, the brain knows that it's going to happen just before it does, and the brain does a lot of prediction. Some people think that the brain, it really, all the brain does can be explained in terms of prediction. Prediction. The brain is constantly predicting, for example, when I make a movement, where my arm and my muscles and everything is going to end up after I make that movement, and how the sensory information coming back in is going to appear, and it makes those predictions. And when something doesn't conform with the prediction, there's surprise. There's an adjustment that's made. But that prediction, that predictive process, allows the brain to have an idea of what's going to happen just before it does. And when we know what's going to happen, the brain concludes that we caused it a lot of the time. So if my arm moves in a way that was unexpected, if there's sensory information coming in that I didn't predict was going to happen, maybe it's because you moved it and not because I moved it. If I moved it, I know it's going to happen just before it does. So surprise is a big aspect of this. And, you can demonstrate this really easily in the motor system. You can see how the sensory effects of our own movements are attenuated when they're predicted. We almost don't experience them at all. That's why you can't tickle yourself. If somebody else moves your hand, or if you enter some unpredictability in this, if you add some unpredictability in the system, it feels like someone else is doing it. It's coming from the outside. I once talked with a group of people. I was very interested in this a while back, and I spent some time talking to people who perform with dowsing rods. You know what dowsing rods are? They're like these little devices that they use to divine the location of water sources. It's basically like a big superstition, but there's this whole community around it. And they hold these rods in their hand. It's like a bent rod. And the rods swing back and forth as you walk around, and they point you towards the source of the water. There's like, they believe that there are energies that are guiding these things. And they have this experience of the rods moving on their own. That's not me moving it. There's some force, there's some energy that's moving the thing. And really the reason they experience that is because the way the rod is set up, there's like a sleeve that holds the rod, and the rod is in it. And the movement of the rod is so chaotic that it's very difficult to predict what the movement is going to be based on the movement of your own hands. So it moves in these very unpredictable, surprising ways that make it feel like there's some kind of outside source there. It's the same thing that happens with like a Ouija board. You can't predict where it's going to go because the movement is the sum of everybody's movements who's touching the Ouija board. And so everyone feels that the Ouija board is kind of moving on its own. So this predictability, I mean, I think this feeling might sort of be just a byproduct of the way the brain is organized to perform things and to predict them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking about playing the piano earlier when you were giving the example of predicted movements, and it certainly seems like that's what happens. You play, you're playing fine, you don't notice, it's at a very high pace, but you make a mistake, and then it's like you're already on the next section, and then you kind of have to adjust back. And surprise, just like you mentioned, it's a surprise.
Yes.
Me making a mistake. Yeah.
Well, it's also can happen. So that's a feeling you can have with your movements, but it can also happen with your own thoughts. And this is what happens in schizophrenia when, one of the theories of the delusions that happen in hallucinations that happen in psychosis is that there's some disruption of this predictive process. If your brain is constantly generating inner speech and you know what that speech is slightly before it happens, at least the brain does, then it feels that it originates with you. But if something goes wrong with that prediction and you're experiencing all this inner speech and it's unpredicted, then maybe it feels like it's coming from an outside source. And that's how you have an auditory hallucination.
Right. So it's your same inner monologue, but you just feel like there are other voices.
Yeah.
Although, why would you have, I mean, in some cases, people report hearing multiple different voices. And then in other cases, they can be like, encouraging you to do negative things. And neither of those seem the case for your normal inner monologue, at least hopefully not.
Well, no, I think we do actually all experience those voices, voices in scare quotes. You do hear, you do have thoughts that occur to you that you sort of dismiss or don't engage with if you're psychologically healthy. But even when you are, I think those thoughts come that are just random negative thoughts, like I should jump off this bridge or whatever it is.
Yeah, you're stuck in traffic or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's something about normally being able to dismiss it completely. But if that goes awry, then you take it more seriously.
Yeah, because the thing that happens with unpredicted events in the mind is that they gain salience, right? And that's partly with the tickling example, that those sensory effects of somebody else touching you are very salient to you because they're not predicted. So when we predict things, we can safely ignore them, but when things are unpredicted, they capture our attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that answered a question I guess I never knew I had. Why can't you tickle yourself?
Right.
So the idea then is that because we discount what's predicted, we either discount it or we assume that we are what causes our own actions, so long as they're predicted actions. And then that can kind of build and give this illusion that we are doing all of these things we set out to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it is an illusion, as you said it. It's a conclusion that the brain is. It's a conclusion of cause that the brain is making, and it doesn't really follow the causal chain back very far, right? Even if I predict that I'm going to move my arm and my arm moves, why did I make that prediction, or how did that decision come about? Relies on earlier events of which I can't be conscious or aware of, but are still causative. So it is an illusion.
Mm-hmm. So are you a believer in Libet's experiments? Not a believer, but like there's one camp that took those experiments showing that you can monitor brain activity of a movement before someone consciously reports choosing to move. Some people said, that's proof there's no free will. Others might say something like, you decide to do things by your own volition before you actually notice you do.
Yeah, right. And in some way, it's kind of orthogonal to the whole question, because yes, of course, there are previous causes to any particular movement. And the question is, do you have some kind of special ownership or role in causing those previous causes? But it's sort of, it's just an incoherent concept to say that you cause them when you have to then define what the you is that caused them. And there's always some earlier psychological process over which you have no control, or which just couldn't have gone any other way given the whole causal chain of the universe. So I think the Libet experiments are informative in showing the particular precursors to our choices and how they do precede consciousness. But I think that sort of had to be the case.